Hey, it's Nathan. Before we start, I want to tell you about a rule almost nobody has heard of, and once you hear it, you'll never forget it. In this country, if your house sits in a flood zone and it gets damaged, and the cost to repair it comes to half of what the house is worth, the town can declare it substantially damaged. That single phrase can end a home. You either raise the whole structure into the air at a cost most families can't survive, or you knock it down. One clipboard, one signature, one number. Now imagine a family figures out that they don't have to wait for a flood to trigger that rule. They can make the water come from inside the walls. That's the story today. A man who moves houses for a living. A boy who was 8 years old and paying attention when the adults thought he wasn't. And a dinner table where every seat was full except, apparently, the one he was sitting in. What that boy whispered took 9 seconds to say. It cost a family 4 generations of money. Stay to the end. The last thing this man does with a house is the part I still think about. The morning the trouble started, Carson Blaisdell was 16 feet under a church. He was flat on his back in the crawl space of a shuttered Methodist chapel in Tanyard Bend, Indiana, with a flashlight in his teeth and one gloved hand resting on a sill beam the width of a railroad tie. He wasn't looking at the beam. He was listening to it. There is a sound old wood makes when it has been carrying weight for 120 years and has decided it would prefer to stop, and Carson had learned to hear it the way a doctor hears a heart murmur. He tapped twice with the butt of a screwdriver. The note came back hollow near the pier and solid 4 feet in. "Rot's local," he called out. 9 feet of sill, that's all. We can needle it and lift clean." Above him, muffled through the floorboards, his foreman Virgil Tolman said something skeptical involving the word budget. Carson Blaisdell was 43 years old, and he moved buildings for a living. Not furniture, buildings. Houses, chapels, a train depot once, a lighthouse keeper's cottage that had to go up a bluff, on a road he built himself out of crane mats and prayer. The sign on his truck said Blaisdell House Moving and Shoring, and under that, in letters his father had chosen in 1979, and Carson had never had the heart to change, it said, "We take our time." That was the whole trade in 4 words. People think house moving is about strength. It isn't. Any fool with money can rent hydraulics. House moving is about patience and arithmetic. You dig, you cut, you slide steel beams through the belly of a structure that does not want them there. You crib it up on stacks of oak timber, and then you lift it an inch a day, sometimes half an inch, watching 100 little glass telltales glued across the plaster cracks. If the telltale breaks, you stop, you wait, you go slower. His father, Delbert Blaisdell, had put it a different way, the way he put most things, which was once and then never again, because he expected you to have listened. You don't argue with the ground, Carson. The ground's been here longer than you, and it's got more time. You want to beat it, you don't fight it. You lift the house off it. Del Blaisdell had bought the house at 411 Lowline Road in 1979 for $11,000 because it was the ugliest sound investment in Ulmer County. Built in 1901 for a tannery foreman, 3 stories of yellow brick and heart pine, standing on the last high shelf of the old Tanyard district, before the land sloped down to the Ohio River. Del raised his family in it, buried his wife out of it, and died in the front room in the winter of 2019, with his boots still on, because he had refused, for 81 years, to be sick anywhere comfortable. He left the house to Carson. He left one other thing, and at the time it seemed like an old man's whimsy, a small brass surveyor's level, the kind with a bubble in a glass tube, worn smooth on both ends from being carried in a pocket for 50 years. There was a note taped to the case. For Carson, it doesn't care who's talking. He kept it on the dash of his truck. Some days he looked at it more than he looked at the road. By the summer of 2024, Carson had a crew of 5, a fabrication shop in a rented Quonset off Ferry Street, and a reputation across 4 states as the man you called when the building could not be replaced. He had a son named Felix, who was 8, who had been born 6 weeks early and had come out of it with a stubborn, watchful quality that made adults uncomfortable. Felix Blaisdell didn't talk much in groups. He watched the room, all of it, all the time. Teachers wrote things on his report cards like observant and reserved and, once, unusually attentive to detail. Carson framed that one. and he had a wife named Lydia. Lydia Blaisdell had been a Vansant for the first 26 years of her life, and in Tanyard Bend, that meant something the way the name of a river means something. The Vansants had come down the Ohio in the 1840s with a flatboat and a grudge, and had been extracting money from that stretch of water ever since. Ferry rights, then a coal tipple, then a gravel operation, then, when the gravel ran thin, the more modern business of owning things other people needed. Vansant River Holdings sat in a low brick building on the levee, with tinted windows and 9 employees, and a client list nobody outside the family had ever seen. Carson had met Lydia when he was 30, and she was 26, and her father had hired him to move a boathouse. It was a stupid job. The Vansant boathouse was a 1920s 2-story shingled thing that some ancestor had built 40 feet too close to a bank that had spent a century deciding to leave. Every other contractor in 3 counties had told Carson Blaisdell to burn it down and build new. Carson had walked the bank, taken elevations, sat on an overturned bucket for 2 hours with a pencil, and then told the richest man in Ulmer County that the building was fine and the ground was the problem, and that for $61,000 he would pick the whole thing up and set it 80 feet inland without breaking a single one of its original leaded windows. He did it in 9 days. Carson Blaisdell, who had never in his life been impressed by anything that could be bought, stood on his lawn and watched a building float across it and said, out loud, to nobody, "Well, I'll be damned." Lydia had been standing next to him. That was the first year. That was the year that made all the rest of it possible. And Carson would spend a long time later trying to figure out whether he had married a woman or an audience. Because here is the thing about the Vansants that took him a decade to understand. They did not dislike him. Disliking a person requires you to think about them. The Vansants had a category for Carson Blaisdell from the first afternoon, and the category was help. Skilled help. Impressive help, even, the way a hunting dog is impressive. He was invited to everything and included in nothing. Beverly Vansant, Lydia's mother, had a way of introducing him at parties that took the air out of the room. "This is Carson. He does the heavy work for us." 22 words into every conversation, the person he was meeting would ask what he charged. He let it go. For years he let it go, because Lydia would squeeze his hand under the table and roll her eyes and say later, in the car, that they were awful and old and that she had escaped them, and that was that. He believed her for 11 years. He had proof in his phone that he was wrong for about 8 months before he let himself read it. They had a son, and for a while it was good. Felix was born in the spring, and Carson took 9 weeks off work, the only 9 weeks he ever took. And he learned that a baby is a lot like a structural lift. You go slow, you watch the telltales, and everything that goes wrong because somebody got impatient. Then the Vansants started to lose money. It happened the way it happens to old river families, quietly and then all at once. The gravel operation had been sold in 2011 to pay off something nobody discussed. The ferry rights had been a fiction since the bridge went in. What was left was land, and land in Tanyard Bend had one problem. Almost all of it was in the floodplain, which meant almost none of it could be developed without spending a fortune raising it out of the water's reach. Almost all of it, not all. The old Tanyard district sat on a natural shelf, a wide bench of high ground that ran from the river up to low-line road. Half of it was above the base flood elevation, half was just below. And in the middle of that shelf, on the highest 3 parcels, sat a yellow brick house built in 1901 by a tannery foreman, occupied by a man named Blaisdell who had no intention of selling it, ever, to anyone. Carson didn't know any of that yet. In the summer of 2024, he knew that his father-in-law had started calling him son, which was new, and that his brother-in-law Paxton had started asking questions about the house at family dinners, which was newer. That old place must be a money pit, Carson. It's dry as a bone. In the flood zone, though, 9 feet above the last high water, Dad picked it for that. And Paxton Vansant, 39, handsome in the way of a man who has been told so, would smile and say, "Huh," and change the subject to boats. Paxton had a company. He'd had 4. The first 3 had failed in ways that required his father's money and one of his father's lawyers. The 4th was called Dry Brook Restoration and Recovery, and it was doing, by all appearances, extremely well. Water damage, fire and smoke, mold remediation, 12 white trucks with a green wave on the door, and a 24-hour dispatch number on every bus bench in 3 counties. That is the business you want in a river town. When water gets into a house, the insurance company pays a stranger a great deal of money very quickly to make the water go away, and nobody watches too closely, because the homeowner is standing in 6 inches of ruin and would sign anything. Carson had actually been glad about Drybrook. He had said so, out loud, at Thanksgiving, that it was good work, useful work, and that Paxton had finally landed on something real. Lydia had looked at her plate. He thought about that look for years afterward. 8 seconds, maybe. A woman looking at a plate. 2 things happened in the spring of 2025 that put the whole thing in motion, and neither of them looked like anything at the time. The first was that Velma Dunphy's house flooded. Velma was 79 and lived 4 doors down at 397 Lowline, in a white-frame cottage with a porch swing and 40 years of hostas. She had taught 3rd grade in Tanyard Bend until 1998, which meant that half the county had at some point been afraid of her. On a dry Tuesday in April, with the river 6 feet below flood stage and not a cloud in the sky, a supply line let go under her upstairs bathroom sink and ran, by the estimate that was later filed, for somewhere between 9 and 11 hours. Carson got there before the trucks did. He'd seen the water coming down her front steps from his kitchen window. He waded into a living room with 4 inches on the floor and a ceiling that had already come down in 2 places, and he found Velma sitting on the stairs in a housecoat with her cat in her arms, saying the same sentence over and over. "I turned it off. I always turn it off." The white trucks with the green wave arrived 19 minutes later. Carson would think about that number a lot too. 19 minutes. Velma hadn't called anyone yet. She had been sitting on the stairs, holding a cat, and Drybrook Restoration and Recovery had already dispatched 2 trucks, 4 men, 16 air movers, and a dehumidifier the size of a chest freezer. At the time, he thought, my brother-in-law runs a tight ship. The second thing that happened in the spring of 2025 was that Carson Blaisdell applied for a permit to elevate his own house. It wasn't a whim. He had been planning it since the day his father died. The 1901 house was 9 feet above the last high water, but the flood maps had been redrawn in 2017, and the new base flood elevation had crept up past the sill, which meant the house was legally in the water, even though the water had never once been in the house. It meant his insurance had tripled. It meant, eventually, that Felix would inherit a building the county considered a liability. So Carson was going to do for his own house what he did for other people's. He was going to jack the whole thing up 4 feet 6 inches, build a new foundation under it, and set it down permanently, legally, unarguably out of the flood's reach forever. He filed the application on the 11th of April. Ulmer County approved it on the 2nd of May. He drove home that afternoon with the approval on the seat beside him, and he did something he almost never did, which was open a beer at 4 in the afternoon and sit on the back steps and feel good about his life. Felix came out and sat next to him and asked how they were going to lift a house that big, and Carson took the old brass level out of his pocket and set it on the concrete step between them and told him about bubbles. "See that? That's the whole trade right there, bud. It doesn't care how loud anybody is. It doesn't care who's rich. You put it down, it tells you the truth about the ground." Felix looked at the bubble for a long time. Then he said, "What if somebody picks it up and shakes it?" Carson laughed. "Then you set it down again and wait." 280 miles away, in a conference room on the 9th floor of a building in Louisville, a developer named Whitcomb Partners was being told that the Reach Landing project could not proceed without 400 contiguous feet of high ground on the Tanyard Shelf, and that the family who controlled the surrounding parcels had assured them, in writing, that the last 3 would be available inside of 18 months. The anniversary dinner was set for the 18th of September, a Thursday, at a restaurant called The Lockkeeper. It was Paxton and Margot's 10th. The Lockkeeper was the sort of place the Vansants liked. An 1890s lockhouse on the old canal cut, restored to within an inch of its life, with iron lanterns and a private room at the back that held 14. Margot had chosen the menu in July. Beverly had chosen the seating chart, which in that family was not a joke. Carson almost didn't go. He had a lift starting Monday, his own lift, the house on Lowline, and he had spent that week doing the part of the job nobody photographs, He had shut the water off at the street on Tuesday and drained the risers, because you do not lift a structure with charged plumbing in it. A copper line under load will part like a wet paper towel, and you will find out about it 3 days later when the ceiling comes down. He had pulled the meter. He had capped the gas. He had run 4 data loggers on the interior walls and glued 11 glass telltales across the old plaster cracks, and he had set up the same monitoring rig he used on every job, 4 small weatherproof cameras, 1 per elevation, wired into a recorder in the cellar with a battery backup and a cellular uplink, because on a lift, you want a time-stamped record of every single thing that touches the building. The house at 411 Lowline Road, on the evening of the 18th of September, was empty of furniture, empty of water, empty of gas, and watched from 4 directions. Nobody at the dinner knew that. Why would they? It was, to them, an ugly old brick house full of a dead man's things. Lydia had been strange for 3 weeks, sharp on the phone, then apologetic, then sharp again. On the Sunday before, Carson had come into the kitchen and she had ended a call so fast, the phone slipped out of her hand into the sink. She laughed about it. He laughed about it. She said it was her mother. They drove to the lockkeeper in 2 cars, which was itself unusual. Lydia went early to help Margot with something. Carson brought Felix at 7, both of them in collared shirts. Felix with his hair combed flat and wet in the way of an 8-year-old who has combed his own hair. The private room was full and loud. 14 people, and the long table had been laid with 15 places, and there was a seat at the far end near the service door with a napkin folded on the plate. Carson sat down in it. Felix took the chair beside him. He would try, later, to describe what happened next to a lawyer, and the lawyer would keep asking him what was said, and he would keep saying that wasn't the point. Nothing was said. That was the point. Carson Blaisdell, at the head of the table, raised a glass and welcomed everyone by name. Everyone. He went around the whole table, all 14 of them, and he skipped 2 chairs, and one of them was Carson's, and one of them was Felix's. A waiter came around with the wine and stopped at the chair before Carson's and turned back the way he'd come, because a hand had gone up and waved him off, and Carson watched Beverly Vansant put her hand back down in her lap. Margot told a story about the honeymoon. Paxton told a story about a boat. There was a moment, maybe 40 minutes in, when the conversation opened up the way conversations do, and Carson said, into the gap, that congratulations were in order, and that 10 years was worth something. The table went on talking. Not a pause, not a flicker. 14 people continued a conversation over the top of a sentence, as if it had been made of air. Felix stopped eating. Carson felt his son's leg go still against his own, and he put his hand flat on the boy's back and left it there, and he thought, very calmly, that this was the last one. Whatever else happened, this was the last dinner. He was making that decision, silently, at a table full of people who had made it for him already, when Felix slid out of his chair and said he had to use the bathroom. The private room at the lockkeeper opens onto a short service corridor. Bathrooms to the left, kitchen to the right. Between them, a door to the old lockyard where the staff smoke. Felix was gone about 4 minutes. Beverly Vansant chose that window to lean toward her husband at a volume that was not meant to be a whisper and was not quite meant to be heard, and say the thing that Carson would still be able to hear in a quiet room 10 years later. Who invited him? And Carson laughed. And Margot laughed. One bright little note. And down the table, Paxton laughed with his head back. And Lydia Blaisdell, who had been a Vansant for the first 26 years of her life, looked at her husband of 11 years for the first time all evening, and laughed too. That was the moment. If you asked Carson to point at it, that was it. Not the money, not the house, not any of what came after. His wife's face, lit up, laughing at a joke whose punchline was that he did not exist. He did not do anything. He sat there with his hands on either side of a plate of food he hadn't touched, and let it land. Then a small hand closed on his sleeve. Felix was back. He was standing at Carson's shoulder, not sitting, and his face had gone the particular color of a child who has decided not to cry in public. He leaned in close to his father's ear, and he said 9 words, so quietly that his lips barely moved. Dad, we have to go now. Don't say why. Every parent knows the difference between a kid who wants to leave and a kid who needs to. It's not volume, it's stillness. Felix Blaisdell was completely still, and his hand on his father's sleeve was shaking, and he was not looking at his father. He was looking down the table at his uncle Paxton. Carson Blaisdell stood up. He did not say goodbye. He did not make a speech. He put his napkin on the table. He put his hand on his son's shoulder, and the two of them walked out of the private room, down the service corridor, past the bathrooms, out the front of the lockkeeper, and into the parking lot, and behind them, the conversation never even changed pitch. He got Felix into the truck. He shut the door. He walked around to his own side, got in, started the engine, and pulled out onto Canal Street before he said one word. "Okay, bud, tell me." Felix told him. The boy had come out of the bathroom and heard his uncle's voice through the propped-open yard door and had stopped, because he was 8, and because his uncle had been using the voice adults use when they are angry at someone who works for them. Felix had stood in the corridor with his hand on the wall, out of sight, for about 90 seconds. What he heard was this: "They're all here. Every one of them. That's the whole point of tonight." Then a pause. "No, not the water heater. A heater looks like arson to a decent adjuster. Upstairs, the supply line under the bathroom sink. Same as the Dunphy place. And you leave the trap and you leave the fitting. You understand me? Leave it looking tired." Then a pause. "You've got until 9. He's sitting at the table right now with his kid and a bread plate. Nobody's going to be at that house until midnight." And then, at the end, the thing that made an 8-year-old boy's hands shake. "And Vern, listen, the old man in the brick house has got a boy. If there's anybody in there, you turn around and you drive away and you call me. I'm not doing that. I'm not doing that part." Felix had come back down the corridor and had walked past his uncle, who was standing just inside the yard door putting his phone in his jacket, and his uncle had looked at him. That was why he said don't say why. Because a boy who is very good at watching a room had understood, in 1 second, with no help from anybody, that if he said it at the table, then the only person who would be warned was the man in the jacket. Carson pulled the truck to the shoulder on Canal Street and sat with both hands on the wheel. He was, in that moment, one turn of the wheel away from being a completely different kind of story. The kind that ends with a man in a doorway and a jury. He had a boy in the passenger seat. He had 600 pounds of pipe wrench and cutting torch in the bed of that truck. He was 2 miles from his father's house, and there were, according to his own brother-in-law, men on their way to it who had been told to make it look tired. He took the brass level off the dash and turned it over in his hand. It doesn't care who's talking. Then he did 4 things, in about 90 seconds, and every single one of them was the reason he won. First, he did not call the police. Ulmer County Dispatch would send a deputy on a burglary in progress, and a deputy would arrive with lights on, and 2 men would drive away from a house they had never entered, and there would be nothing at all. A trespass maybe, a conversation, and a family that would know, from that night forward, that Carson Blaisdell was watching them. Second, he did not call anyone in the family, not one of them. Third, he opened his phone and checked the recorder in the cellar. 4 cameras, all green, 41 hours of storage on the loop, cellular uplink live. He turned the loop off and set it to continuous. And fourth, and this is the one that Gloria Oglesby would later call, in open court, the most elegant thing she had ever seen a civilian do. He remembered that the house had no water in it. He had shut the main at the street on Tuesday. He had drained the risers. There was not one drop of pressurized water in the building. Carson started the truck and drove home slow. He put the truck in the pole barn, out of sight, on the far side of the hedgerow. He and Felix went in through the cellar door. He checked the 4 camera angles on the recorder, adjusted the northeast unit 2 degrees to cover the side entry, and confirmed that the porch fixture, which was on a solar cell and not on the house circuit, was working. Then he unlocked the side door. He left it unlocked, and he left it open 2 inches. He took Felix out through the hedgerow and across to Velma Dunphy's, and he stood on that old woman's porch at 10 minutes to 9 and asked her if his son could sit in her kitchen for an hour. Velma looked at his face and did not ask a single question. She said, "There's pie," and she put her hand out for the boy, and Felix went. At the bottom of the porch steps, Carson stopped and turned around. Velma, when your line broke, had you had anybody in the house in the weeks before? She thought about it, 79 years old and sharp as a tack. The insurance man came about the roof in March. He was up in the bathroom a good while. He said he was checking the vent stack. Do you remember his name? He had a green wave on his shirt, she said, same as the trucks. Carson walked back across the field in the dark and stood in the hedgerow beside his father's house and waited. They came at 9:14. A white panel van, no green wave on the door. A plain one, and later that would matter a great deal, because a company that owns 12 marked trucks and 1 unmarked van has already had a thought. It parked on the gravel apron by the pole barn with its lights off. 2 men got out. Neither of them hurried. One carried a small canvas tool bag, and one carried nothing at all. And they walked up to the side door, and the one with the bag put a gloved hand on it and found it open, and said something Carson couldn't hear, and they went in. The lights of the house did not come on, because the power was off at the panel. The 2 of them went up to the second floor with headlamps. Carson stood in the dark hedgerow and watched 2 beams of light move across the wall of his father's bedroom. 11 minutes later they came back out, and the one with the bag stood on the gravel with his hands on his hips and said, loudly enough to carry across a still September field, "There's no water in it." That was the sentence. That was the whole case, said out loud, in the open, at 9:26 p.m., 40 feet from a camera on a house that belonged to Carson Blaisdell. "I cut the line," the man said. "I cut it, and it's dry. Whole house is dry. He's pulled the meter." The second man said something about the river, and the first one said no, and then, into a phone, in a voice pitched high with the beginning of panic. "Pax, it's Vern. There's no water. He's shut it off at the street and drained it out. No, I did it right. I did it exactly like the Dunphy one. Nothing came out." "Well, what do you want me to do? Carry it in? Then tell your father-in-law to keep him at that dinner till we figure—" And then Vern Chalmers stopped talking, because a man had walked out of the hedgerow into the open with a flashlight and a brass surveyor's level in his hand, and had said, in the most reasonable voice either of them had ever heard, "Evening. Line's dry because I'm lifting the house Monday. You'd have known that if anybody at that table had ever asked me a question." Vern Chalmers was 46 and had worked water mitigation for 19 years. And the thing about a man like that is he is not a criminal. He is a technician who has been told what to do by somebody who signs his checks, and he has been telling himself a story about it for a while, and when the story breaks, he breaks with it. He stood on the gravel with the phone still lit in his hand and said, "I want you to know I never do it if there's people home." "I know," Carson said. "I heard the call. My son heard the call." The second man, Dexter Swanberg, 24, started toward the van, and Carson stepped out of the way and made a small polite gesture with the flashlight, like a man directing traffic at a church. "Go on," he said. "Both of you. Nobody's stopping you." That is the part nobody believes when they hear this story. He let them leave. He didn't put a wrench in his hand. He didn't block the van. He didn't call the sheriff, and he didn't hold 2 men at a strange hour on a dark road where the story could be turned around inside a week into a jealous husband and a false imprisonment charge. He stood in his own driveway with his hands loose and let 2 men drive away, and then he went inside, sat down on the cellar steps in the dark, and downloaded 11 minutes and 40 seconds of video onto 3 separate drives. He watched it once. He watched a gloved hand cut a copper supply line under his father's bathroom sink with a mini tubing cutter, and then loosen the fitting above it a half-turn with a pair of channel locks and leave it that way. Tired looking. A house's own fault. An old building giving up. Then he watched a man stand in his driveway and say, to a phone, the name Pax. Carson Blaisdell had one thought, and it was not about revenge, and it was not about his marriage. It was, how many times have they done this? He got a legal pad out of the truck and sat down at the kitchen counter of an empty house with no lights and wrote, by flashlight, a list of every water loss he could remember on the shelf in the last 4 years. Velma Dunphy, 397 Low Line, April 2025. The Kirkpatrick Place on Ferry, 2024. They moved to Evansville. The little duplex on Tanyard Row. Elmer Ivester's shop on the corner. He'd had a sprinkler line let go in a building that Carson happened to know had never had a sprinkler system, only the dead riser of one, capped in 1988. 4. He could think of 4 off the top of his head, on 3 streets, in a district with maybe 60 structures on it. He sat with the pad in front of him for a long time. Then he did the thing that decided the next 14 months. He did not drive to the lockkeeper. He did not call his wife. He turned his phone over, wrote nothing changes on the top sheet of the legal pad, tore it off and stuck it to the flashlight, and drove to Velma Dunphy's to pick up his son. Felix was asleep at the kitchen table with a fork in his hand. Velma stood up and looked at Carson, waiting. "Velma," he said, "on Monday I'm going to lift that house. If anybody asks you, that's the only thing happening on this road. Can you do that?" Velma Dunphy had taught 3rd grade for 29 years and had never once, in the whole of her life, been asked to be useful in something that mattered. "Son," she said, "I can be the dullest woman in Indiana." Lydia came home at 11:40. Carson was in the living room with a coffee. "You embarrassed me," she said. He had thought about this for 2 hours and had decided on the exact shape of it, and he was surprised at how easy it was to hold his face still. "Felix wasn't feeling right," he said. "I got him home." "You could have said something. You walked out of my brother's anniversary." "I know. I'm sorry. It was the kid." And Lydia Blaisdell, who had laughed with her mother about whether her husband existed, stood in her own living room and looked at him, really looked, for the first time in a year, and Carson watched her check him, top to bottom, the way you check a lock you're not sure you turned. "Is he all right?" she said. "He's asleep." "Okay. A beat. Okay. Good." She went upstairs. Carson sat in the dark and understood 2 things. First, she knew. Not the details maybe, not the tubing cutter and the fitting, but she knew there was a reason tonight mattered, and she had checked his face for it. Second, and this was worse, she had been the one who told them he was coming to dinner. He went to work on Monday and he lifted the house. That is the piece of this story that makes people laugh out loud when they hear it. In the middle of the worst month of his life, Carson Blaisdell went to work at 7 in the morning with a crew of 5 and started digging under his father's house. They cut 6 openings through the foundation on the long walls. They slid 2 40-foot main beams through the belly of the building and cross-beamed them with 8 needle beams, and on the Thursday, they set 42 hydraulic jacks on cribbing stacks of oak timber laid up like a child's log cabin, 6 feet by 6 feet, and they took the whole 3-story yellow brick house off the ground. An inch a day, sometimes half. Virgil Tolman walked the perimeter every morning with a notebook and read the 11 glass telltales glued across the plaster cracks and called out the numbers, and Roland Dunwoody sat at the manifold with his hand on the valve and moved 110 tons of 1901 brick a quarter turn at a time, and by the 2nd week of October, the house at 411 Lowline Road was standing 4 feet 6 inches in the air on a forest of timber, with the sky visible underneath it. People drove out from town to look at it. It became a thing you did on a Sunday in Tanyard Bend that fall. Take the kids down to Lowline and see the flying house. Paxton Vansant drove past twice. Carson waved both times. Here is what was actually happening while he waved, and it took him until the end of October to see the whole shape of it, and when he did, he sat in his truck in a parking lot for 40 minutes without moving. There is a rule in every community that participates in the National Flood Insurance Program, and it is not a secret. It's in every floodplain ordinance in the country. If a structure in a special flood hazard area is damaged, and the cost to restore it to its pre-damage condition equals or exceeds 50% of its market value before the damage, then that structure is substantially damaged. Once that determination is made, the owner can no longer simply repair it. The building must be brought into full compliance with current flood standards, meaning elevated above the base flood elevation, or it must be demolished. For a family with money, that is an expensive inconvenience. For a 79-year-old retired schoolteacher on a fixed income whose house is worth $91,000, it is the end of the house. 3 people make that machine run: the contractor who writes the repair estimate, the adjuster who values the loss, and the local floodplain administrator, 1 municipal employee, who signs the determination. Drybrook Restoration and Recovery, wrote the repair estimates. A public adjuster named Melvin Grimsley, who had an office above a nail salon in New Albany, and who had been retained on 11 of the last 13 losses in the Tanyard district, valued them. And Norval Quimby, who had been the Ulmer County floodplain administrator and building official for 22 years, and who had a boat slip at the Vansant Marina that he had never in his life paid for, signed them. Loss occurs. Drybrook arrives. Fast. Always fast. Drybrook writes an estimate that is generous in the way an ocean is damp. Grimsley confirms the value of the structure at a number that is somehow always low. The ratio crosses 50%. Quimby signs a substantial damage determination and mails it certified. And then, 3 or 4 weeks later, when the homeowner has stopped sleeping, a very kind man from Vansant River Holdings calls to say he heard about the trouble, and that he'd hate to see anybody in a bind, and that they'd be willing to take the property off their hands for the land value. Cash. Fast close. No inspection. Velma Dunphy got that call on the 6th of June. She turned it down because she was stubborn. Elmer Ivester took it, in 2023, for $104,000, for a corner building and lot his family had held since 1946. And the National Flood Insurance Program, which is to say the federal government, which is to say everybody, paid the claim on every single one of those losses. Plus, on 4 of them, a $30,000 increased cost of compliance payment, which is money the program pays a homeowner precisely because their building has been declared substantially damaged. They had built a machine that manufactured a flood, one house at a time, and got paid 3 separate ways for it. And the reason they had to have 411 Lowline Road was that the Reach Landing development needed 400 contiguous feet of buildable high ground, and Carson's 3 parcels were the highest ground on the shelf, and, this was the elegant part, the part that made Carson actually admire them for about 9 seconds. The moment he elevated that house and got his elevation certificate, the property would be permanently compliant. It could never be declared substantially damaged again. It could never be condemned. It would sit on the highest ground in the Tanyard district, above the flood, forever. In the middle of a 400-foot rectangle, a developer in Louisville had already drawn on a map. That was why it had to happen on the 18th of September. Not because of the anniversary. The anniversary was the alibi. Every relevant Vansant in a room with 14 witnesses and a reservation stub, on the last Thursday before a house that was about to become permanently untouchable came off the ground. Carson did not tell his wife he knew. He did not tell his lawyer for 2 more weeks, and when he did tell her, he told her in a diner outside Corydon, with the video on a laptop and the legal pad beside it. Gloria Oglesby was 61, had practiced in southern Indiana for 34 years, and had a way of listening with her chin down that made you certain she wasn't impressed. She watched the 11 minutes and 40 seconds twice. She read the pad. She looked at the 4 addresses. Then she took her glasses off and said, "Mr. Blaisdell, do you understand what you have? A trespass and a busted pipe. You have a federal case." She tapped the pad. "Every one of these claims was paid through the National Flood Insurance Program. That's a federal program. That's not a county sheriff and a prosecutor who plays golf with Carson Blaisdell. That's mail fraud, wire fraud, and false statements on a federal insurance claim. And the 50% determinations make your building official a party to it." She put her glasses back on. "How many of these do you think there are?" "I found 4. "Find the rest," Gloria said. "Don't guess. Don't estimate. Bring me paper." So he did. He spent November and December being the dullest man in Indiana. He went to work. He set the new foundation under his father's house. He took Felix to school. He sat through Thanksgiving at the Vansant house on the levee and passed the potatoes to Beverly. And when Paxton asked him how the lift was going, he said, "Slow," and let the silence do its work. And on nights and weekends, he pulled paper. He pulled the deed records for every parcel in the Tanyard district back to 2018, which is public and free and takes 11 hours if you are patient. He mapped the transfers. He found 19 properties that had gone through a substantial damage determination in Ulmer County in 6 years, and 17 of them were in the Tanyard district, and 14 of those 17 had been sold within 90 days to one of 4 limited liability companies whose registered agent was the same lawyer in Jeffersonville. He drove to Evansville to see the Kirkpatricks. He sat in Elmer Ivester's kitchen for 2 hours and let an 81-year-old man cry about a building. And in January, a 22-year-old water mitigation technician named Toby Hollenbeck asked to meet him in the parking lot of a hardware store. Toby had been at Drybrook for 19 months. He had gone in as a kid who wanted to be a firefighter and hadn't made the list, and he had found something almost as good, showing up on the worst day of somebody's life with equipment. He was good at it. He liked the old people best. And then, about 8 months in, he had started noticing that certain jobs came in through a different phone. "There's the regular dispatch number," he told Carson, "in a truck, in the cold. And then there's jobs Vern hands you on paper, handwritten. And on those, the moisture map's already filled out before you get there." He was shaking, and it wasn't the cold. "You know what that means? Somebody drew the map of where the water went before anybody went in the house. Did you keep any?" Toby Hollenbeck looked out the windshield for a long moment. "I kept all of them," he said. "Every handwritten one, 22 months. I don't know why. I took pictures of the moisture maps with my phone before I turned them in, since March of last year, because Vern told me once that if anything ever came back on a job, it'd come back on the tech that signed it, and I figured—" He stopped. "I figured I'd want to be able to show somebody I did my job right." Carson Blaisdell sat in a cold truck in a hardware store parking lot and did not let his face move at all. "Toby," he said, "I'm going to give you a lawyer's phone number, not mine, yours." In February, Gloria Oglesby made one phone call, and it did not go to the Ulmer County Sheriff, and it did not go to the Ulmer County Sheriff, and it did not go to the Ulmer County Sheriff. It went to a special agent named Patricia Yarborough at the Department of Homeland Security Office of Inspector General, whose entire job, for 9 years, had been fraud against the National Flood Insurance Program, and who had spent most of that career chasing contractors who padded estimates by 15%. Agent Yarborough drove down from Indianapolis on a Tuesday, expecting to spend an hour being polite. She was still in Gloria Oglesby's conference room at 9 o'clock that night, with 14 deeds, 19 determinations, 22 months of handwritten work orders, 406 photographs of moisture maps that had been drawn before the water was found, and 11 minutes and 40 seconds of video in which a man cuts a pipe in an empty house and then says the name of the person who sent him. At about 8:30, she had stopped taking notes and started making phone calls in the hallway. At 10, she came back in, sat down across from Carson, and said the first genuinely warm thing anybody in a position of authority had said to him in 6 months. "Mr. Blaisdell, whatever you do for a living, you'd have made a hell of an investigator." "I move houses," Carson said. "Yeah," she said. "You keep saying that." There was one more thing Carson had to do, and it was the only part of the whole 14 months that made him feel sick. He had to let them keep going. Agent Yarborough put it plainly in the conference room. What he had was a burglary and a cut pipe, and a mountain of paper that a good defense lawyer would spend 2 years calling a coincidence. What she needed was one clean, complete, documented cycle of the machine. The loss, the estimate, the valuation, the determination, with a federal signature at the end of it, on a property where every single variable was known. "You want them to do it to my house," Carson said. "They already tried to do it to your house," she said. "I want them to finish." So he did nothing. He finished the new foundation. He set the house down on the 28th of February, 4 feet 6 inches higher than it had stood for 124 years, and he had it surveyed by a licensed land surveyor out of Corydon who had never met a Vansant, and he got an elevation certificate that put the lowest floor 2 feet 1 inch above the base flood elevation. And then, on Gloria's instruction, he did not file it. He put it in a drawer. In April, the letter came. It came certified, from the Ulmer County Building and Floodplain Office, signed by Norval Quimby, and it said that an inspection conducted on the 6th of April had documented significant interior water damage at 411 Lowline Road, consistent with a plumbing failure of extended duration. That a repair estimate prepared by a licensed restoration contractor totaled $209,000. That the market value of the structure prior to damage had been established at $381,000. No, not that. $281,000. 52%. The letter declared the structure substantially damaged. It notified the owner that repair was prohibited, that the building must be brought into compliance or demolished, and that a demolition order would issue in 60 days. Carson read it standing at his mailbox on a Thursday afternoon. Then he laughed out loud on an empty road for about 15 seconds, which frightened a dog. They had inspected a house on the 6th of April. He had 4 cameras on that house, running continuously, since the 18th of September. Nobody had been inside it. Not one human being had crossed the threshold of 411 Lowline Road between the 28th of February and the day that letter arrived. Norval Quimby had signed a federal program document describing interior water damage in a building he had never entered, on a date when the building was standing on a new foundation, dry, empty, and photographed from 4 directions every second of every day. Carson drove the letter to Gloria Oglesby's office and put it on her desk and said, he wrote it down. Gloria read it twice. Then she took her glasses off and set them on the desk very carefully, the way you set down something you are afraid of dropping. Mr. Blaisdell, she said, go home and be quiet for 6 weeks. The appeal hearing was set for the 4th of June, 9 o'clock, in the Ulmer County Government Center, a public hearing before the Board of Zoning Appeals, because Carson had filed an appeal of the determination, which is what a desperate homeowner does, and desperate homeowners lose those hearings roughly always. It was, on paper, the most boring event on the county calendar. Garrison Vansant came anyway, so did Beverly. Paxton came in a blazer with Margot. Norval Quimby sat at the staff table with a folder. Melvin Grimsley sat in the second row with his phone out. There were 11 other people in the room, most of them there for a variance about a pole barn. And Lydia came, and she sat on the Vansant side, and she did not look at her husband once. They were there to watch. That is the piece Carson understood about that family. Finally, the last true thing he learned about them. They didn't need to be there. The outcome was arranged. They came because watching was the good part. Carson Blaisdell sat at the appellant's table in a clean shirt with a cardboard box beside his chair and his hands folded. The chairman called the appeal. Quimby read his determination into the record in a flat voice, 4 minutes, and concluded that the county's finding was supported and that the appeal should be denied. The chairman asked, without much interest, if the appellant wished to be heard. Carson stood up. Yes, sir. I've got 4 things. He put the first one on the overhead, the elevation certificate, signed and sealed by a licensed surveyor on the 3rd of March, showing the lowest floor of 411 Lowline Road at 2 feet 1 inch above the base flood elevation. This house is compliant. It's been compliant since February. You can't substantially damage a compliant structure out of existence. There's nothing to bring into compliance. That's the first thing. He put up the second, a single frame of video, time-stamped, of a yellow brick house standing on cribbing with the sky under it. Mr. Quimby's letter says an inspection on April 6th documented interior water damage of extended duration. That's the second thing. There's 4 cameras on that house, and they've been running since September 18th, and I've got every frame. Nobody came. Nobody's been inside my father's house since the 28th of February. He looked at the staff table. Mr. Quimby, did you go in my house? Norval Quimby, 22 years a public official, made the mistake of his life, which was to answer. I sent a deputy inspector. What was his name? The room got very quiet. The third thing, Carson said, is that the reason there was no water damage in my house is that on September 16th, I shut the main off at the street and drained every line in the building because I was lifting it on the 22nd. And on the night of September 18th at 9:14 p.m., while every adult in that row over there was sitting at the lockkeeper at my brother-in-law's anniversary dinner, 2 men in an unmarked van came to my house and cut the supply line under the upstairs bathroom sink and loosened the fitting above it so it would look tired. He pressed play. They watched 11 minutes and 40 seconds on a wall in a county hearing room, a gloved hand, a tubing cutter, a fitting turned a half turn and left, 2 beams of light on an old bedroom wall, and then a man on gravel in the dark, saying, in a voice picked up clean by a doorbell microphone 40 feet away, "There's no water in it. I cut it, and it's dry. Pax, it's Vern. He's shut it off at the street. Then tell your father-in-law to keep him at that dinner." Somewhere in the second row, Melvin Grimsley put his phone in his pocket. "The fourth thing," Carson said, and he reached down into the cardboard box, "is that this has happened 19 times in 6 years, and 17 of them are within 4 blocks of my house, and 14 of those 17 were bought inside 90 days by 4 LLCs that share a registered agent." He set a stack of deed printouts on the table, and every one of those losses was paid by the National Flood Insurance Program. That's not county money. That's federal money. He stopped. He looked at the chairman. "That's all I've got, sir. I'd like my house left alone." The chairman of the Ulmer County Board of Zoning Appeals opened his mouth and did not get to say anything, because the doors at the back of the room opened. Agent Patricia Yarborough came in with 4 people. 2 more went to the staff table. She did not raise her voice, which somehow made it much worse. She simply walked to the front, identified herself and her office to the board, presented a sealed federal search warrant for the records of the Ulmer County Building and Floodplain Office, and told the chairman, politely, that she was going to need the room. By 9:40 that morning, agents were at Drybrook Restoration and Recovery on Ferry Street, at the offices of Vansant River Holdings on the levee, at a nail salon in New Albany with an office above it, and at a house on a bluff where Beverly Vansant kept her seating charts. Paxton Vansant was arrested in the hallway outside the hearing room, in a blazer, in front of his wife. He was crying before they got him to the elevator. The indictment came down in September, 1 year and 1 week after the anniversary dinner, and it ran to 91 counts. Paxton Vansant, conspiracy to commit wire and mail fraud, false statements in connection with federal flood insurance claims, and, on 11 separate occasions, the intentional destruction of property with intent to defraud an insurer. He pleaded in March, 241 months, 20 years and 1 month, and the extra month was the judge's arithmetic on the 18th of September, because Judge Dorothea Stallworth said in open court that she was sentencing him separately for the decision to send 2 men into a house that he had reason to believe might contain an 8-year-old boy. Garrison Vansant, 71, the man who had raised a glass and skipped 2 chairs, pleaded to conspiracy and money laundering. 132 months, 11 years. He was 68 days into it when he had a stroke in a federal medical center in Kentucky. Norval Quimby, 22 years a public official, took a plea for 84 months and cooperation, and he gave them everything, every conversation, every determination, a marina slip he had never paid $1 for, and the fact that the deputy inspector who conducted the April 6th inspection of 411 Lowline Road did not exist and never had. Melvin Grimsley surrendered his adjuster's license in 5 states and got 51 months. Vern Chalmers walked in through the front door of the Indianapolis field office with a lawyer on the second day and gave a proffer that lasted 9 hours. He got 18 months, and he served 14. And in his allocution he said one sentence that Carson has never repeated to anybody except his son. "I want the court to know I checked every one of those houses for people first, and I want the court to know that doesn't make it better." Beverly Vansant was not charged. There was no statute for what she did. And Lydia. It was the answering machine that did it. Velma Dunphy, 79 years old, still had a machine with a cassette in it, and she had kept the tape from June because she kept everything, and on it there is a woman's voice, warm, sorry, kind, saying that she'd heard about Velma's trouble, and that her family hated to see a neighbor in a bind, and that they'd be glad to take the property off her hands so she wouldn't have to worry anymore. Lydia Blaisdell had made 41 of those calls over 4 years. She was the kind voice. That was her whole job at Vansant River Holdings, and it was on an offer letter, and her name was on 11 acquisition files. She pleaded to a single count of conspiracy and got 37 months, and the reason it was only 37 months is that she cooperated fully, and the reason she cooperated fully is that Gloria Oglesby had already filed for divorce and full custody, and Lydia had understood, in one afternoon, what she was actually bargaining for. She got supervised visitation. Felix went once. He was 9 by then. He sat across a table from his mother for 22 minutes, and on the drive home he looked out the window for a long time, and then said, "Dad, is it bad that I don't want to go back?" And Carson Blaisdell, who had spent 14 months being careful with every single word out of his mouth, pulled over on a county road and said, No, bud. You get to decide who you spend your life on. That's the whole thing. That's the only thing. Reach Landing never broke ground. Whitcomb Partners withdrew in the first week, the way developers do, with a press release about market conditions. The 4 LLCs were unwound in the civil forfeiture that followed, and this is the part Carson likes best, and the part he had absolutely nothing to do with. 14 properties came back. Not all of them to the original owners. Some of those people were dead, and some had moved to Arizona and did not want to hear the name of the town again. But Elmer Ivester got his corner building back at 81 years old and put a sign in the window that said, Ivester and Son, EST. 1946, REST. 2027, which made no sense and was perfect. Velma Dunphy's house was rebuilt with restitution money and a crew that Carson lent her for 9 days, and she did not pay for a single hour of it, and she has never stopped trying to. Toby Hollenbeck was not charged with anything. He testified for 2 days. He is, at the time of this telling, 24 years old and in his second year at the Indiana Fire Academy, and Carson wrote the letter. And on a Saturday morning in May, Carson Blaisdell filed the elevation certificate for 411 Lowline Road with the Ulmer County Building and Floodplain Office, which by then had a new administrator, and got it stamped and drove home, and put it in the same drawer where his father had kept the deed. The house sits 4 feet 6 inches higher than it did. You can see it from the river, on the underside of the main floor joists, in the crawl space where nobody will ever look. There's a line of chalk in an 8-year-old's handwriting that says, "We take our time," because Felix asked if he could write something before they closed it in, and his father said yes and didn't ask what. The following September, on the 18th, Margot Vansant's 11th anniversary went unobserved. She had moved to Cincinnati by then and had taken her maiden name back. Carson took Felix to the lock keeper. He had thought about it for a month and had decided it wasn't cruel, it was just accurate. They sat in the main dining room, not the private one, and had the pork chop, which is what you get there. And at some point, Felix looked up from his plate and said, "Dad, why here?" And Carson said, "Because a year ago in that room back there, a whole table of people acted like my chair was empty, and I want you to see that it wasn't." Felix thought about that, the way he thought about everything, for about 11 seconds. Then he said, "Their chairs are empty now, though." "Yeah," Carson said, "that's the thing about chairs." "Okay, Nathan again. I've told a lot of these stories, and I want to be honest about what got me with this one, because it isn't the 91 counts. It's the 4 minutes. An 8-year-old kid walked down a hallway to use the bathroom, heard something he only half understood, and made a chain of decisions that most grown adults would not make under pressure. He didn't scream. He didn't announce it. He didn't tell 14 people at a table, which is what every instinct in a scared child says to do. He worked out, in about 1 second, standing in a corridor with his hand on a wall, that the only person who'd benefit from him talking out loud was the man who'd just seen him. So he waited. He went back to the table, and he told exactly one person, quietly, and told him not to ask why. Kids are watching. That's the takeaway I'd hand you. They're watching all of it. Who gets skipped in the toast? Who gets waved off by the wine? Who gets laughed at? Felix Blaisdell knew what that table thought of his father long before that hallway, and that's precisely why he trusted his father with 9 words, instead of trusting the room. And the second thing, the one I actually needed to hear myself, Carson's whole win came from doing nothing at 3 separate moments, when doing something would have felt incredible. He didn't flip the table. He didn't grab the man in his driveway. He didn't call the sheriff who golfs with the family. He drove home, let 2 men leave, and then went to work on Monday like a man with nothing on his mind, for 14 months. That's not weakness. That is the most aggressive thing in this entire story. Loud gives your enemy an exit. Quiet gives them enough rope and a time-stamped camera. His father told him, "You don't argue with the ground. You lift the house off it." He never argued with them once. He just kept raising his life a ½ inch at a time until they couldn't reach it, and then he handed the paperwork to the federal government. If a room ever decides your chair is empty, don't shout. Take notes. Sit down somewhere else and keep the receipts. I'm Nathan. Thanks for sitting with me on this one.